January 1945. The western edge of Germany trembles under the weight of collapse. Snow, half melted and gray with ash, clings to the broken earth. The sky hangs low, a dull ceiling of smoke and winter cloud. Columns of American armor grind forward, their engines cutting through the silence left behind by a retreating enemy. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a camp waits, unmarked on most maps, but not unknown. At the front of this advance rides George S. Patton, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on a horizon that no longer resembles victory. The war, for him, has always been about movement, speed, aggression, domination of terrain. But hey, the air itself feels different. Heavy, resistant, as if the land is holding its breath. The gates come into view slowly. Barbed wire stretches in endless lines. Wooden towers stand hollow, and beyond them, stillness. No gunfire, no resistance, only silence, broken by the faint creak of something loose in the wind. An American soldier, barely more than a boy, reaches into his coat and pulls out a small ration, an untouched chocolate bar, standard issue. He turns it in his hands for a moment, as if unsure what purpose it serves here. Around him, men begin to step forward, boots crunching against frozen mud, their expectations still shaped by every battlefield they have known before. But this place is not a battlefield, and whatever waits beyond those gates will not be measured in territory, or strategy, or victory, but in something far more difficult to confront, something that will follow them long after the war itself has ended. The gates stand open. By early 1945, the war in Europe had entered its phase. The machinery of the Third Reich, once driven by speed and relentless, was beginning to fracture under the pressure of a two-front collapse. From the east, the Soviet pushed forward with overwhelming force. From the west, Allied formations advanced steadily, methodically breaking through what remained of German defenses. That had once seemed unstoppable was now turning inward, consuming the very it had conquered. At the center of the Western advance stood Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces, orchestrating a campaign designed not for dramatic breakthroughs, but for total, irreversible pressure. His strategy emphasized coordination, American, British, and other Allied units moving in calculated synchronization. It was a war of discipline and inevitability. And yet, within that structure, there were men who embodied a very different kind of. Among them, none was more distinct than George S. Patton. Patton's Third Army had become a force defined by. Where others paused to consolidate, he pushed forward. Where resistance stiffened, he maneuvered around it. His reputation had been forged in the rapid advance across France following the breakout from Normandy, where armored columns moved with it that seemed almost reckless to some, but devastatingly effective in practice. To his men, he represented aggression with purpose. To his, unpredictability. But as his forces crossed deeper into Germany, the nature of resistance began to change. Organized German counterattacks became increasingly rare. Instead, what they encountered were fragments, retreating units, abandoned positions, cities left in partial ruin. The signs of a collapsing state were everywhere. Broken rail lines, burned supply depots, civilians moving silently along roads, carrying what little remained of their lives. Yet beneath this visible collapse lay something far less understood. For years, Allied intelligence had gathered reports, fragmented, often dismissed, sometimes doubted, about a network of camps scattered across German-controlled territory. These reports spoke of forced labor, of prisoners held in extreme conditions, of systematic brutality. Names surfaced in documents, in intercepted communications, in testimonies from those few who had escaped. But the scale, the organization, the true purpose of these sites remained unclear to most soldiers advancing toward them. To the average American infantryman, the war still followed a familiar pattern. You advanced. You engaged. You secured ground. The enemy was visible, armed, and defined by uniform. Even in its brutality, combat had structure. What awaited them ahead did not. Within the German command structure, there was an unspoken understanding that certain were never meant to be seen by advancing armies. As defeat became inevitable, efforts were made to evacuate some camps, to destroy records, to erase evidence. Guards were ordered to retreat, sometimes abandoning their posts entirely. In other cases, prisoners were forced into desperate marches deeper into shrinking German territory, events that would later be known as death marches. But not everything could be hidden. As Patton's units moved forward, they began to encounter signs that did not fit the pattern of conventional railcars left on sidings, sealed but not empty. Buildings surrounded not by defensive fortifications, but by layers of barbed wire. Civilians who avoided eye contact, their silence heavier than fear. There was a growing sense, unspoken but shared, that something existed beyond the front lines, something that had operated in parallel to the war everyone thought they understood. For Patton himself, the campaign into Germany was meant to be the demonstration of operational excellence. His focus remained on objectives, on the relentless forward motion that had defined his command. Yet even within his structured view of, there were moments when the logic began to fracture. Reports from forward became harder to categorize. Descriptions lacked clarity, but carried an unmistakable weight. The war was no longer just about defeating an army. It was about uncovering what that army had been protecting. And as the distance between Patton's advancing columns and these hidden sites continued to close, the line between combat and revelation began to dissolve, leading directly toward a reality that none of his men had been prepared to witness. The deeper Allied forces pushed into Germany, the more the structure of the itself began to unravel. What had once been between opposing armies was now revealing layers that extended far beyond the battlefield. Towns surrendered without resistance. Military units dissolved into populations. Chains broke down. And yet, scattered across this collapsing landscape, there remained places that did not fit the pattern of End. They were not defensive strongholds. They were not objectives. And yet, they had been guarded with a different kind of intensity. Long before the first American units approached these sites, fragments of information had already reached Allied command. Intelligence reports, some intercepted, others gathered from networks or escaped prisoners, spoke of it that operated in secrecy but with industrial precision. These were not isolated incidents of brutality. They suggested coordination and purpose. Names appeared in documents. Camps like Buchenwald concentration camp, Dachau concentration camp, and others scattered across occupied Europe. To analysts, they were marked as detention or labor facilities. To political leaders, they were troubling, but distant. The full reality remained obscured by the fog of war, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy, denial, and disbelief. For the soldiers advancing on the ground, these names meant nothing. What they expected was shaped entirely by their experience of combat. They anticipated resistance, perhaps desperate last stands, isolated pockets of German troops defending what remained of their homeland. Even in victory, they prepared for violence, for the final of a defeated enemy unwilling to surrender. But as forward reconnaissance units began reporting back, the details did not align with those expectations. There were compounds surrounded by multiple layers of barbed wire, but no artillery positions. Watchtowers stood intact, yet unmanned. Gates were sometimes open, as if abandoned in haste. And inside, movement, but not of soldiers. Initial descriptions were hesitant. Soldiers struggled to find the right language. They spoke of figures, thin, unsteady, wrapped in fabric that barely resembled uniforms. They described silence where there should have been orders, confusion where there should have been structure. Some reports mentioned the smell first, an odor that lingered in the air, difficult to identify, impossible to ignore. For commanders like George S. Patton, these reports created a tension between skepticism and urgency. In a war defined by clarity of ambiguity was unsettling. Yet the consistency of these accounts, coming from multiple units, could not be dismissed. Within the German ranks, the reality was far more deliberate. The camp system had been an integral part of the Nazi state, administered through organizations like the SS. These were not improvised facilities. They were planned, expanded, and maintained over years. As Allied forces approached, orders were issued to conceal evidence. Documents were burned. Structures were dismantled where possible. Prisoners were relocated under extreme conditions, forced into marches that would claim countless lives before the war even ended. Yet time had run out. The Allied advance, particularly under aggressive commanders, disrupted these efforts. Camps were overrun before they could be emptied. Guards fled without completing their orders. Systems designed for secrecy were suddenly exposed to. For the German soldiers and who had operated within or alongside this system, the expectation had always been that these places would remain hidden or at least misunderstood. Even as defeat loomed, there was an assumption that the narrative could be controlled, that the scale of what had occurred would be fragmented, diluted, or lost in the broader chaos of war. What they did not anticipate was the direct, immediate encounter between these sites and that of an advancing army, men who would see, document, and carry these images beyond the of Germany. As American units moved closer, the contrast between expectation and reality sharpened with each mile. The familiar patterns of enemy positions, defensive lines of engagement, gave way to something entirely different. There was no tactical framework for what they were about to witness. Only the slow realization that the war had always contained a hidden dimension, one that had operated quietly, efficiently, and with devastating consequence. And now, as Patton's forces stood on the threshold of these discoveries, that hidden dimension was about to collide with the visible world of soldiers and itself, forcing a confrontation not just with an enemy, but with the true nature of what they had been fighting against. The first angle was human, raw, immediate, and impossible to structure within the logic of war. American soldiers, hardened by months, some by years, of combat, had learned to process destruction in a particular way. Ruined towns, fallen comrades, even the violence of close, these were experiences that, however brutal, still belonged to the known language of. There were objectives. There were outcomes. There was a reason, however distant, that connected each action to a larger purpose. What they encountered inside the camp stripped that framework away. Men who had advanced through artillery fire now found themselves unable to move forward at all. Some stood still, as if the mind refused to accept what the eyes were seeing. Others reacted with sudden urgency, offering food, water, anything within reach, despite orders to proceed cautiously. Medical personnel, trained for battlefield, were confronted with conditions they had never been prepared to treat. Starvation on a scale that defied comprehension, bodies reduced to fragile outlines of survival. It was here that the small symbols of the American soldier began to take on a different meaning. The standard ration, the chocolate bar, carried in a coat pocket more out of habit than necessity, became something else entirely. It was no longer just sustenance. It was abundance. It was proof of a world where survival was assumed, not denied. And yet, even this simple offering revealed a painful truth. Many of those it was given to could not consume it, the bodies too weakened to accept what had once been ordinary food. The second angle was that of the enemy, not the encountered in battle, but the system that had operated behind the lines. Within the of Nazi Germany, these camps were not anomalies. They were extensions of policy, administered with bureaucratic precision under organizations like the SS. Records were kept. Orders were followed. Roles were defined with clarity that removed the need for individual reflection. For those who had served within or alongside this system, expectation had been shaped by distance. Distance from consequence, from accountability, from the human reality of their actions. The camps were often framed in terms that abstracted their purpose: labor allocation, detention. Language itself became a barrier, allowing individuals to operate within the system without fully confronting its outcome. But as Allied forces arrived, that distance collapsed instantly. Captured personnel, guards, administrators, found themselves face to face with the system they had once experienced as routine. The environment that had been normalized within their own hierarchy now existed under a different gaze, one that did not share the same assumptions, the same justifications, or the same silence. The third angle centered on leadership, specifically the presence of George S. Patton. Known for his discipline and aggressive command style, Patton had built his reputation on clarity of and decisiveness in action. His understanding of war was rooted in movement, in measurable outcomes, in the application of force to achieve strategic goals. Yet here, with what lay inside these camps, that framework offered no immediate guidance. Historical records suggest that even seasoned commanders were deeply affected by what they witnessed. Reports were written, orders were issued to document everything, to ensure that evidence would be preserved. There was a recognition, at the highest levels of command, that this was not merely another aspect of them. It was something that needed to be recorded, understood, and ultimately presented to the world. Patton himself, a man rarely associated with hesitation, was confronted with a reality that could not be addressed through maneuver or alone. The discipline he demanded from his troops now extended into a different domain: the discipline to observe, to record, to confront without turning away. These three perspectives, human, enemy, leadership, began to converge into a single, undeniable realization. The war was no longer defined solely by the defeat of an opposing army. It had become a process of exposure, of bringing into the open something that had been deliberately concealed. And as this realization deepened, it set the stage for further layers of understanding, moral, symbolic, and psychological, that would transform not only how the war was remembered, but how those who witnessed it would carry its meaning forward. The fourth angle emerged not from what was seen, but from what it demanded. It was moral. War had always carried its own internal logic. Soldiers were trained to act within boundaries defined by orders and necessity. Violence, however intense, was directed. It had purpose. Even destruction could be justified within the framework of achieving victory. But inside the camps, that framework collapsed entirely. There was no tactical objective that explained what had taken place here. No battlefield necessity. No value. What remained was a question that could not be answered through military doctrine. What is the appropriate response when confronted with systematic cruelty on this scale? For many American soldiers, the immediate instinct was emotional, anger, disbelief, a desire for justice that bordered on something more immediate, more personal. Yet command structures held firm. Orders emphasized control, documentation, restraint. The priority was not revenge, but evidence. Not reaction, but record. Even in its final days, demanded discipline, not only in action, but in judgment. This restraint would later define how these were understood globally. It created the foundation for accountability, for trials, for the transformation of outrage into something structured, something that could endure beyond the moment. The fifth angle was symbolic, and it returned to something small, almost insignificant in any other context. Food. The same chocolate bar that had once been an afterthought in a soldier's pocket now carried a weight far beyond its size. It represented more than nourishment. It stood as a quiet contrast between two systems, one built on provision, the other on deprivation. In the hands of an American soldier, it symbolized a world where resources, however limited by war, were still distributed with the assumption of survival. Within the camps, its presence highlighted the absence of that assumption. This contrast was not lost on those who witnessed it. The act of offering food became more than charity. It became recognition. recognition that the individuals before them had been denied not just sustenance, but dignity. And in that moment, the simplest object, a wrapped piece of chocolate, carried within it the idea of abundance, of humanity, of a that, despite its flaws, was rooted in the preservation of life rather than its systematic destruction. The final angle was psychological. For the soldiers, this was a turning point that extended beyond the war itself. Until this moment, the conflict had been defined by objectives: take the hill, secure the town, advance the line. Success and failure were measured in territory gained or lost. But what they encountered here introduced a different metric entirely: understanding. The enemy was no longer just a uniform, a position, or a force to be defeated. It was an ideology, one that had justified, organized, and executed actions on a scale that defied ordinary comprehension. And confronting that reality required a shift in perception. Many soldiers would carry these images with them long after they've ended, not as memories of combat, but as evidence of something deeper. Letters sent home began to change in tone. Reports became more detailed, more urgent. There was a growing awareness that what had been discovered needed to be known, not just within military circles, but by the beyond. For the German side, the psychological shift was equally profound, though of a different nature. The collapse of the Reich had already begun to dismantle the structures of authority and belief. But exposure added another layer: the removal of denial. Civilians living near camps, officials who had operated within the system, soldiers who had chosen not to question orders, all were now confronted with a reality that could no longer be distanced or abstracted. The illusion of separation, the idea that these acts were isolated, hidden, or misunderstood, began to dissolve. And as these moral, symbolic, and psychological dimensions converged, they created a pressure that could not remain contained. It moved toward a single moment, a confrontation not just between individuals, but between truth and the structures that had attempted to conceal it. A moment where presence alone would no longer be enough, where something would have to be faced directly. The moment did not arrive with the noise of battle. There was no artillery barrage, no charge, no, that history was about to shift. Instead, it unfolded in an almost unnatural silence, the kind that settles when have already occurred, and only their consequences remain. By April 1945, as elements of the U.S. Third Army advanced through Germany, sites like Buchenwald concentration camp had already begun to fall into Allied hands. Reports reached higher command with increasing urgency, their language no longer tentative. What had once been described in fragments was now visible, undeniable, and immediate. Senior commanders were ordered to witness these firsthand. Among them was George S. Patton. When Patton arrived at one such, the structure of the camp was still intact: rows of barracks, perimeter fences, watchtowers standing in rigid lines. But the system that had once controlled it was gone. Guards had fled or been captured. The order that had defined daily life here had collapsed, leaving behind only its. Historical accounts from this period describe how Allied commanders were deliberately guided through these camps. That was clear, to ensure that what had been discovered could never be dismissed as exaggeration or rumor. Every detail was to be observed, every condition recorded. For Patton, a man accustomed to assessing terrain in terms of movement and strategy, this environment presented something entirely different. There was no tactical advantage to be gained here, no maneuver to execute, only observation, and the weight that came with it. Captured German personnel were often brought back into these spaces under guard. Some had served directly within the camps. Others were officials, individuals who had lived in proximity to what had occurred. In several documented instances across liberated camps, civilians were compelled to walk through these grounds, to witness what had been hidden behind layers of structure and language. The confrontation, therefore, was not a single exchange of words or actions. It was a forced recognition, that had once allowed individuals to operate within the system, whether through direct involvement or silent acceptance, was removed completely. Standing within the same space, seeing the same conditions, there was no longer any barrier between action and consequence. For the American soldiers present, this process carried its own intensity. They were no longer just observers. They had become witnesses in the most direct sense. The evidence was not abstract. It existed around them, in the buildings, who had survived within these confines. Patton's role in this moment was defined not by command in the traditional sense, but by presence. His authority, his reputation, his identity as a military leader all converged into a single responsibility: to see, to acknowledge, and to ensure that what was being uncovered would be carried beyond this. Accounts from multiple commanders during this indicate that the experience of walking through these camps left a profound impact. The detachment of leadership, the ability to process events in terms of strategy and outcome, was challenged by the immediacy of what they encountered. The war, in that instant, ceased to be an abstraction of maps and movements. It became something physical, tangible, inescapable. And as this confrontation unfolded, not through words, but through forced witnessing, it began to break down the final layers of distance that had separated those responsible from the reality of their actions, setting the stage for a deeper, more irreversible reckoning. What followed was not a sudden explosion of action, but a deepening of something far more powerful, recognition turning into irreversible truth. In the days after the first discoveries, Allied command moved quickly to ensure that what had been found could never be denied, distorted, or buried beneath the war. Orders were issued under the authority of Dwight D. Eisenhower to document everything in precise detail. Photographs were taken. Film units were brought forward. Reports were written with a level of clarity that left no room for ambiguity. Eisenhower himself insisted on visiting sites such as Ohrdruf concentration camp, one of the first camps encountered by American forces. His reaction, recorded in letters and official communication, emphasized a single concern: that the world might one day question of what had occurred. The only answer to that possibility was evidence, witnessed firsthand by those in positions of authority. Within this framework, the confrontation expanded beyond individuals. German civilians from nearby towns were gathered and escorted through the camps. Local officials, some of whom had claimed ignorance, were brought face to face with a system that had operated within miles of their homes. In documented cases, they were ordered to walk through the barracks, to observe the conditions, to see what had been hidden in plain sight. This was not an act of vengeance. It was an act of exposure. For the civilians, the experience dismantled the final refuge of denial. The war, which many had experienced through rationing, propaganda, and distant reports, now existed in a form that could not be reconciled with any narrative they had been given. The proximity of these camps, geographically close, yet psychologically distant, became impossible to ignore. For captured German personnel, the confrontation carried a different weight. The structured environment in which they had operated, defined by hierarchy and routine, no longer existed to contain or justify their actions. Stripped of that structure, they stood within the role of their participation, whether direct or indirect. For the American, this moment marked a shift in understanding. The war was no longer just about defeating Nazi Germany as a military power. It had become a moral reckoning. Though victory expanded beyond territory or surrender, it now included the responsibility to reveal, to document, and to ensure that what had been discovered would become part of the permanent historical record. It was during these moments that the smallest symbols took on their deepest meaning. The same ration, simple, mass-produced, carried across continents by American forces, appeared again within the camps. Chocolate, canned food, bread. Items designed for efficiency, for sustaining an army in motion. Yet they represented something entirely different. They became evidence of a system built on provision rather than deprivation. on sustaining life rather than systematically destroying it. But even this symbol carried a quiet tragedy. Many survivors, weakened beyond recovery, could not benefit from what was offered. Medical teams worked urgently, learning in real time how to treat bodies that had endured prolonged starvation. The process of liberation was not immediate healing. It was the beginning of an uncertain struggle for survival. As documentation continued, as witnesses multiplied, and as the scale of what had occurred became clearer, the confrontation reached its true culmination, not in a single act, but in the establishment of undeniable truth. A truth that would move beyond the boundaries of. A truth that would demand accountability. And a truth that would shape everything that followed, leading directly into a new phase, where the focus would shift from discovery to consequence, from witnessing to judgment. The aftermath of the confrontation did not unfold like a single event. It unfolded like a widening, spreading across military command, civilian populations, and eventually the entire post-war world order. As American forces secured liberated sites across Germany in April and May 1945, reports were rapidly compiled and transmitted upward through Allied command structures. What had been witnessed on the ground was no longer isolated testimony. It had become documented reality. Units under the command of George S. Patton contributed detailed operational reports describing the conditions they encountered, while other formations across the Allied front confirmed similar discoveries at multiple locations. The immediate priority was containment, not of evidence, but of chaos. Medical teams were deployed under extreme urgency. Starvation, disease, and physical collapse required intervention on a scale that military logistics had never previously faced. Field hospitals were established near liberated camps, and supplies were redirected from combat support to survival support. The battlefield had transformed into something entirely different, a humanitarian emergency embedded within a war zone. At the same time, Allied command insisted on strict documentation procedures. Photographic units, intelligence officers, and war crime investigators were ordered to preserve every detail. This was not optional. It was strategic. The leadership understood that the credibility of what had been discovered would depend entirely on its preservation. Even in this structured response, emotional impact was unavoidable. Soldiers who had advanced through Normandy, the Ardennes, and deep into Germany now found themselves tasked with guarding evidence instead of seizing territory. Many described the experience not as exhaustion, but as disorientation. The sense that the war they thought they were fighting had revealed an entirely different layer beneath itself. Within German society, the collapse of denial began to accelerate. Civilians from nearby towns, many of whom had lived within short distances of camps like Buchenwald concentration camp, were confronted with physical evidence that could not be dismissed. Allied forces organized controlled visits in several locations, bringing local through the sites to observe conditions firsthand. Official military report from the period emphasized that these visits were intended to establish undeniable awareness of what had occurred. The psychological impact of these confrontations was profound. Many civilians expressed shock, disbelief, or refusal to accept responsibility. Others displayed visible collapse under the weight of realization. The distance between knowledge and acknowledgement, once maintained by propaganda, silence, or willful ignorance, had been forcibly removed. For captured German personnel, the aftermath took a more formal direction. Investigations began almost immediately. Individuals associated with camp administration were separated, interrogated, and classified according to their roles. The emerging framework would later contribute directly to the legal processes of the Nuremberg trials, where responsibility would be assessed not only in terms of direct action, but also participation within a system of organized. On the Allied side, the revelations fundamentally altered the moral architecture of the war's conclusion. Victory was no longer framed solely in military terms. It was now inseparable from accountability. The defeat of Nazi Germany carried with it an additional burden, ensuring that what had been uncovered would not fade into ambiguity or historical distortion. Leaders such as Eisenhower repeatedly emphasized the necessity of public awareness. He understood that future generations might struggle to comprehend the scale of what had been discovered unless it was preserved with absolute clarity. This concern shaped decisions regarding documentation, public disclosure, and the involvement of international observers. And beneath all of this, the reports, the trials, the reconstruction, there remained the human residue of what had been witnessed. Soldiers wrote letters home that struggled to contain what they had seen. Some avoided description entirely, relying instead on silence. Others attempted to translate experience into words, only to find language insufficient. What they carried was not just memory, but transformation. The war in Europe had ended militarily, but its consequences, moral, psychological, and historical, had only just begun to unfold. And within that unfolding, the role of witnesses like Patton and his men became part of a larger narrative, one that would define how the world understood not only the end of a war, but the responsibility of those who survive it. As the weeks following liberation turned into months, the consequences of what had been uncovered began to reshape not only Germany, but the entire framework of post-war justice and memory. The most immediate and formal outcome emerged through the legal reckoning that would become the Nuremberg trials. High-ranking Nazi officials, military commanders, and administrators were gathered under international custody to face charges that had no precedent at this scale: crimes against humanity, war crimes, and systematic persecution. The evidence collected from liberated camps, photographs, survivor testimonies, military reports, formed the backbone of prosecution. This process was not simply legal. It was historical. For the first time, the international community attempted to define responsibility for state-organized atrocities in a structured, judicial form. The scale of documentation ensured that denial would become increasingly difficult to sustain. What had been witnessed by advancing Allied forces, including units under George S. Patton, was transformed into permanent record. In the former German territories, the psychological aftermath continued to deepen. Entire towns that had once existed in proximity to sites like Dachau concentration camp were now forced into long-term confrontation with their geographic and historical reality. Reconstruction was not only physical, it was moral. Infrastructure had to be rebuilt, but so did identity, accountability, and public memory. Allied occupation authorities initiated programs of denazification. These efforts aimed to remove former Nazi influence from political, educational, and administrative systems. However, the process revealed complex layers of participation and silence. Not all involvement had been direct. Some had been bureaucratic, some passive, some shaped by fear, others by belief. Sorting responsibility from circumstance became one of the most difficult challenges of the post-war transition. For the Allied soldiers who had witnessed the camps firsthand, the return home introduced a different kind of struggle. Many carried what later generations would recognize as psychological trauma, though at the time it had no formal definition within military doctrine. They returned to civilian life, but not to the same perception of the world they had left behind. Ordinary scenes, food, crowds, silence, sometimes triggered involuntary recollections of what they had seen in Germany. Letters and memoirs from the period reflect an ongoing attempt to reconcile two realities: the world they had known before the war and the one revealed during its final months. The symbolic contrast that had first appeared inside the camps remained with them. The simple American ration, the chocolate bar, the preserved food, the standardized supply kit, continued to represent more than sustenance. It became, in memory, a marker of difference between systems, one that assumed survival as a baseline condition of life, and another that had stripped that assumption away entirely. Within historical reflection, this contrast would come to define how the war was understood in moral terms. It was no longer only a conflict between nations or armies. It was also a confrontation between ideologies of human value, between systems that preserved life and systems that devalued it. For commanders like Eisenhower and Patton, the burden of leadership extended beyond victory. It extended into testimony. Eisenhower's insistence on documentation ensured that future generations would not encounter these events as abstraction. Patton's reports and operational records contributed to the military understanding of what had been encountered, embedding it within official history rather than leaving it to memory alone. As Europe moved into Reconstruction, the physical scars of war began slowly to fade. Cities rebuilt, borders redefined, institutions restored. But the moral and historical scars remained embedded in global consciousness. The discovery of the camps had permanently altered the way the world understood modern warfare. It introduced the necessity of accountability beyond the battlefield, and it reshaped international law, human rights discourse, and historical memory for generations to come. What began as an advance through collapsing territory had ended as something far larger, a revelation that forced humanity to confront not only what had happened during the war, but what had been hidden within it. And in that revelation, the role of witnesses, soldiers, commanders, civilians, became inseparable from history itself. In the quiet that followed the war, Europe no longer sounded like the front lines of conflict. The artillery had fallen silent. The armored columns had stopped moving. Even the air, once filled with smoke, orders, and urgency, began to settle into something closer to stillness. But beneath that stillness, nothing truly returned to what it had been before. The events uncovered during the final advance into Germany remained fixed in the historical consciousness of the world. Not as rumors, not as fragmented accounts, but as documented truth, preserved through reports, photographs, testimonies, and the disciplined record-keeping enforced by Allied command. What soldiers under commanders like George S. Patton had witnessed was no longer confined to memory. It had become part of permanent history. The significance of those discoveries extended far beyond the collapse of Nazi Germany. They forced a fundamental shift in how modern civilization understood war itself. Victory could no longer be measured only in territory gained or armies defeated. It now carried an additional responsibility, the obligation to confront what had been hidden and to ensure that silence could never again protect such systems from exposure. In the aftermath, the world began to build new structures of accountability. International law expanded. Human rights frameworks began to take shape. The Nuremberg trials stood as one of the earliest attempts to translate moral catastrophe into legal judgment, establishing that participation in organized crimes could not be dissolved by hierarchy, distance, or obedience alone. Yet beyond institutions and treaties, something more personal remained. For those who had walked through camps like Buchenwald concentration camp, the experience became a permanent part of perception. Many of them never described it in full. Some could not. Others chose silence not out of forgetfulness, but because language felt inadequate to carry what they had seen. The human mind, trained for war, had encountered something that war itself could not fully contain. And still, within that darkness, a small symbol lingered. A simple ration. A piece of chocolate. Standard American supply. It had appeared almost insignificantly at first. Something carried in a pocket, offered without ceremony. But in memory, it became something larger. It represented a world in which survival was assumed, not denied. A world where systems, however imperfect, were structured around sustaining life rather than systematically erasing it. That contrast between deprivation and abundance, between destruction and preservation, became one of the quiet moral undercurrents of the entire war's final phase. It did not erase the horror of what had been uncovered, but it clarified what the confrontation had revealed, that ideology is not only expressed through armies and borders, but through the value it assigns to human existence itself. For Europe, reconstruction would take decades. Cities would rise again. Governments would stabilize. Generations would grow who knew the war only through stories and records. But the responsibility born from those final discoveries remained embedded in global memory, an unspoken warning carried forward through time. The war had ended,